Okay, so I'm going to be talking about plasmodial slime molds, which are a kind of weird, interesting kind of organism. And so I'm just going to let some slides run in the background so you know, see pictures of what I'm talking about. But I should probably start by explaining why I'm talking about these bizarre organisms at an affect conference. So I'll just very briefly try to introduce what I'm trying to do. Okay, so this is, believe it or not, even though I'm going very close to biology, it's a talk about affect theory, okay? Most of the conferences talked about humanities, cultural studies, and the more theoretical, less quantitative end of the social sciences. So I'm not a biologist, but I'm sort of, and we had weird science, the very first, Lisa Blackman's talk, the very first primary plenary, so I'm giving you a little more semi-weird science at the end. Okay, so how can I say this? Basically, okay, this comes from, I have a much longer thing which I'll probably skip because I want to get to the slime molds, about these questions many panels have raised about futurity, and I think much of my work recently has dealt either with A, science fiction, or with B, music videos, both of which I feel are my ways of accessing, aside from the intrinsic interest, it's my ways of accessing the question of futurity. I can come back to that at the end, but slime molds have been around for hundreds of millions of years, so they don't really fit under futurity. But here's the thing. Okay, so I just finished writing a book called Discognition, which should come out this spring 2016 from Repeater Books. It's mostly about science fiction, but what it's really about is, as I said, affect theory. It looks at questions about consciousness, cognition, sentience, and so on. In particular, the way neuroscientists and analytic philosophers have talked about these subjects. And what I'm trying to do is by using science fiction to give kind of alternative paradigms of our understandings of these various aspects of what could broadly be called mentality, or sentience is really the word I prefer for reasons that I hope will be apparent. So most of the book consists of readings of science fiction narratives, not written narratives, so short stories and novels by various science fiction authors which actually deal with these kind of questions which the philosophers and neuroscientists have answered in their own way. And part of the big thing is something which hasn't been talked about, but the dominant paradigm outside of the little bubble of us affect theory people is basically cognitivist paradigm, cognitive psychology, cognitive theory of mind, cognitive science. So I kind of think it's more important to try to inhabit the discourse and both take from it what can be taken and critique what needs to be critiqued than it is to use psychoanalysis or phenomenology, which is what people in our fields are more likely to be using. But to really talk about it, I think we need to contest and not just contest, but I mean both enter into and contradict at the more dominant discourse. So that's why one of the reasons why I've been doing this. And just to give you an example, for instance, one chapter of the book, which has actually already been published as an article, is about a short story by the American science fiction writer Maureen McHugh called The Kingdom of the Blind. And it's a short story. It's only about 6,000 words. It has a double subject matter. One subject matter, it's about the plight of women working in male-dominated infotech industries and what a bummer that is for them, basically. And the author actually interviewed women working in IT places to get a basis. The other part of the story, though, is about a completely boring computer expert system which regulates things like make sure the temperature is right in various hospitals, or the video cameras surveillance cameras haven't run out of batteries. And yet it starts to develop what seems to be signs of sentience. And so the short story builds a model of sentience based on this speculative story, okay? And so the trouble is, although the computer system seems to be sentient, it's so alien to anything we understand that we can't communicate with it. And how do you even know that something is sentient if you can't communicate with it? So that's the example of the kind of thing I'm doing. But in the last chapter of the book, what I did was, does this disappear? guess does it just, okay, I think it may just, the screensaver, but okay, I'll keep on trying to renew it. Anyway, okay, so for the last, I've been fascinated for years by these organisms, plasmodial slime molds. And so what I basically did was that I read a lot of scientific papers about recent research about these organisms and treated the research papers in the same way I treated the science fiction narratives. But, it's not that I'm doing something very heavily hermeneutic or deconstructive with the narratives. I basically am just taking them as reports and taking them fairly literally as reports and drawing the consequences from what they tell us about sentience. And if there's a guiding thing for the whole book, it's the analytic philosopher Thomas Nagel's article from the 1970s, What is it like to be a bat? Nagel says that bats seem clearly to be sentient, to have an inner life. It's like something to be them, but they're so different from us that it's almost impossible for us to imagine what they're like. We can only sort of do it indirectly in various ways. So all the texts I'm talking about are trying to do this not with bats, but with other entities, either fictional entities or actual entities, and ask what is it like to be them? What would the inner mental life of these organisms or computers or whatever be? So basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to ask that question for slime molds. So I'm not going to try to read the whole thing verbatim because it's really written to be read, not to be heard. So I'll try to summarize as I go. I'll skip around and summarize as I go along, but give you a sense of how looking at this actually contributes to some of the founding assumptions of thinking about questions of mind, and therefore hopefully relates to affect theory. Okay, so what is it like to be a plasmodial slime mold? How does such an entity think and feel and encounter the world? The organism known as Physarum polycephalum is so strange that it seems like an alien life form from a science fiction novel, and yet it lives and grows all over the world. Plasmodial slime molds, also known as true or acellular slime molds, class Myxomycetes, also sometimes called Myxogastria, split the difference between unicellular and multicellular forms of life. In the primary portion of its life cycle, a plasmodial slime mold has millions of nuclei, so it's multicellular, except they're all contained within the membrane of a single enormous cell. It divides, but the division doesn't lead to separate cells. As the organism grows, mitosis occurs, as it does in all eukaryotes, organisms with nuclei. The nucleus with its chromosomes splits and replicates itself. But in slime molds, unlike either its unicellular amoeba relatives or like any multicellular organisms, like all animals, all plants, and all funguses, the doubling of the nucleus is not accompanied by cell division. It just expands and becomes this larger and larger blob of protoplasm. In this stage, it's a colorful, massive protoplasm, like some of the yellow things you've seen in some of these photos, which I guess it doesn't want to do it anymore, so we can just forget about it. Sorry. But I mean, you got some sense of what they were like. So it might be too obnoxious if it was actually flashing for a whole half hour. Okay, anyway. So it's sort of like a tiny version of the science fictional monster, the Blob, which is probably based on slime molds initially. So it's not like 12 feet across. It's like this. It can be this big. I found ones on my college campus which circle around the base of a bark of a tree. They actually move. They're not rooted in the earth like fungi. They move around. They engulf small bits of prey, which are either dead organic matter or bacteria or other things like that. It explores its environment, searching for food. It eats this decaying organic matter. It eats by engulfing everything within its cytoplasm and then dissolving it. Okay. The fly mold is characterized by these continuous rhythmic pulsations because it's that both takes nutrients from one site to the rest of the mass, and also, as we'll see, is signals for decision making because of its size, which compared to the size of a normal cell is very large. It has a complicated life cycle. When it reproduces, it sort of dries up and leaves spores, and the spores go into the wind, and when the spores land in any place, they become unicellular organisms, except its sexual reproduction has occurred. So the spores are like sperm and egg cells in animals and plants. They have only one set of chromosomes instead of two, and two of them have to fuse in order to start growing again. But they forage and eat things as unicellular zygotes anyway. Unlike animals and plants. They don't have separate types like sperm and egg. They actually have 4 different sexes, sort of, but they're not anatomically different from each other. They just, each one can only fuse with one of the other 3, or something like that. I was actually trying to find out, scientists haven't been doing experiments on this very recently. The other thing, I told a biologist about this, when it's unicellular, it can either be an amoeba or a little thing with a flagella, a tail, which as it moves through water, and nobody's observed what is the basis, chemical or DNA basis of its ability to do this. But anyway, they fuse, they have sex, they fuse, and then they grow again into these big blobs. Okay, so it's a very interesting organism because it seems to fit in, but it doesn't fit either unicellular or multicellular forms. All what we consider multicellular organisms have specializations. They have tissues, they have different types of cells specialized for different things. This is completely undifferentiated, even though it's just a large blob. It has millions of nuclei. As I said, the big point about it, so I should probably just get to that instead of, because it'll take too long otherwise, is that it makes decisions, it thinks, okay? It's sentient. It thinks, it makes decisions, and part of what scientists have been interested in is how does it make these decisions. So the way it makes decisions is that, I mean, it's neither one nor many, because what the decision center seems to be the nucleus, because the way organisms in general work is by turning on and off different bits and pieces of DNA to do different things. And that's controlled by the nucleus, but it has millions of nuclei spreading several inches around, so it has to send these rhythmic pulsations through its body in order to create a kind of consensus of what to do. It's sort of like, it's really a good example of what Deleuze and Guattari call a multiplicity, because it isn't really unified. It's a multiple, but it's not separate. The multiple is not composed of separate individual units either. So what I'm really trying to do is just draw out philosophical implications which exist sort of in the margins of what the scientists have said, and that's the first thing I would draw. But they've done, the most recent research since about 2010 has had to do with its sentience or intelligence or ability to solve problems. What it can do is it can solve mazes. So, you know, if you have a maze, you put the slime mold at one end of the maze, you put food at the other end of the maze, it takes a long while. It only moves at about 1 centimeter per hour, so it's very slow by our standards. But you can see it move when you use time-lapse cameras. There's actually a documentary about slime molds which has recently opened. It opened in Detroit, where I live, on Friday, so I'll hopefully see it tomorrow evening after I get back home. But you know, it'll eventually be on DVD or streaming or whatever. But anyway, it's a documentary about slime molds, and apparently they do a lot of this, you know, photography. So if you have the timeless fiber, you can see it is moving, and eventually, if you leave it for a day or two, at the end of the period, it's solved the maze, meaning that it extends from its initial point to where the food is and does not extend anywhere else. It's solved. It finds the most quickest and most accurate passage to get through the maze, and it just does that. How does it do it? It works by trial and error. It has a kind of external memory, so it sort of sends out extensions of itself in different directions. If it doesn't find food, the extensions withdraw and leaves some slime behind, and the slime's a signal that don't go there. So it's really a kind of external memory. A biologist I talked to said, well, this isn't really memory, but, you know, actually, the theory of extended cognition, which has been popular in a lot of recent analytic philosophy, basically says that our memories are not just inside our brains. I mean, if I don't remember a phone number because it's on my phone and when I press the button, it automatically dials, in effect, my phone's part of my prosthetic memory. And the same way writing was before we had cell phones. You know, I mean, if you accept that memory is not just embodied inside our skulls, then you can say that our memory is often prosthetic or external, and so is the slime molds. It also has time memory. Slime molds really have preferences for certain conditions. They like it when it's kind of moist and cool. They don't like it when it's hot and dry. So scientists have developed these like weird sadistic experiments to find out their capacities. So one of the experiments was they put the slime mold in an environment it liked, but every hour they suddenly hit it with hot, dry air, and it would stop moving. Like it was flinching, it would stop moving. And they'd do that for 5 minutes, and then they'd let it go back to the initial conditions. And then another hour later, they again zapped it with the hot, dry air, and it stopped moving. And then when they took it away, it started again. They did this about 3 times, and the 4th time, when the hour was up, the slime mold stopped, like it was already expecting so it has I mean, it's very Kantian. The spatial memory is external, but the temporal memory is internal, which is, I mean, Kant wouldn't be surprised if he had known that slime molds could think. You know, I mean, so what does this mean? I mean, it asks a lot of questions about mentality, which is something I've been very interested in. Some of my earlier books, one of my recent books, I argued sort of more or less for panpsychism, which is the philosophical doctrine which was held by Spinoza and Leibniz, among others, and Whitehead, that all materiality, everything in the universe has at least an incipient degree of mentality to it. And the only way you can explain things like subjectivity, consciousness in organisms like ourselves is that somehow it's at least a tendency which is intrinsic to matter. Now, most mainstream philosophy rejects this, obviously, but even today among analytic philosophers, Galen Strawson is a very well-known analytic philosopher who very strongly maintains panpsychism on basically the grounds I just said, that emergence can only explain so much. There are all kinds of ways in which you see phenomena emerge, but there has to be something from which they emerge, and he says we can't really imagine something completely unmental from which mentality would emerge. So that's, I mean, but it's very hard to argue that like a rock is conscious, okay? I mean, or an electron. So I wouldn't really argue that. I would argue that somehow materiality or matter intrinsically contains potentialities for mentality. But it seems increasingly clear on the basis of recent scientific research that it's not just animals which think, and things which don't move like plants or funguses or even bacteria and other unicellular organisms seem to have certain degrees of sentience, certain degrees of mentality. So the real question is about how we think about these in relation to dogmas or beliefs we have about you know, there's several issues here. One is consciousness, and I've done a lot of reading on analytic philosophers talking about consciousness. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. But what basically happens is that you can read like 25 or 30 articles by different analytic philosophers about consciousness. They're all very brilliant. They're all beautifully argued. I find each one of them totally convincing, but then I read the next one, which argues that the previous one was an idiot and that it's actually something completely different. And I find whichever one I read last, I find totally convincing. So my only meta experience of this is basically that nobody knows a fucking thing about consciousness, okay? I mean, you know, there's no other way. I mean, we just don't know. That doesn't mean that it's unknowable. It may be at some point we'll figure it out, but we're not, despite all the gains in neuroscience in the last 20, 30 years, we still aren't at square one of figuring out what consciousness could be. And then there's the question of whether consciousness, whether mentality extends beyond consciousness. I mean, for which the answer is probably yes. We have already psychoanalysis, and even before that, Nietzsche and others in the 19th century argued that non-conscious mental activity was a reality. Freud sort of formalized this. Contemporary cognitive psychology and cognitive science of mind are obviously not at all psychoanalytic, but they also argue that many mental processes are non-conscious. They may not be saying that they're repressed in the way that Freud and Lacan talk about repression and other such things, but it seems indubitable at this point that the overwhelming majority of our own experiences, mental activity is non-conscious, and in many cases it's inaccessible to consciousness. And this, I mean, but this has to, I mean, people have done this with things like sensory processing. Like when we see, they've traced the neural pathways of vision, and basically signals which come into our eyes get processed in multiple centers of the brain. They get sent around all over. They're distributed. They're parallel. Different types of neural cells do different things. Like one will analyze color, one will analyze motion, one will analyze horizontal, vertical, and all these other things, and then it gets integrated back again. And again, they know these are happening. They don't have any good account of how it works. I mean, things like MRI scans, which are very popular now, sort of say, well, certain mental areas of the brain are lighting up or are more active when certain mental processes take place. But that really doesn't, that's been oversold in the sense that it's interesting data, but it doesn't really tell us very much because it doesn't really tell us how it works. I mean, it's just so complicated and so massive. And, I was just reading an article, the worm C. elegans is a worm has only like 365 neurons in its entire brain and body. So they've used it as an organism to study because it's tractable. It's unlike the hundreds of millions of neurons in a mouse brain or the billions of neurons in a human brain. But even with only 365 neurons, they can't figure out a lot of the complicated things that this animal's doing. But we have something sort of even more interesting with slime molds, with Physarum polycephalum, because it doesn't have a brain at all. And yet it definitely seems to exhibit mental activity. Now, actually, Brian has claimed that this is already true of Ronald Reagan, but he said that in print. But leaving that aside, I think the slime molds definitely demonstrate that thought and sentience are possible without a brain. Okay, but the question is how does this happen? And again, we don't really know, though. They've done all these studies. It seems that the slime mold experiences space and time and processes space and time in certain ways. It seems that its mental calculations have to do with, again, distributed processes, just like the current belief is that in any animal brain, human or animal brain, we have distributed processes over millions of neurons. Processes in the slime mold are, even though it doesn't have specialized organs, are distributed because they're these rhythmic pulsations. It confirms my general tendency to think that, everything, the base of the cosmos is rhythm or vibration, which is sort of what both Alfred North Whitehead and George Clinton say. So I think there's a high probability that's right. But anyway, that's, okay. So slime molds seem to make these distributed decisions by these pulsations passing through their entire protoplasm. They figure out all these things. They figure out routes through mazes. After they did some of the simple maze experiments, what they did was stuff like somebody in Japan put a pattern of slime molds really like oat flakes. It's like their favorite food in captivity, at least. So the scientists, put a slime mold at one corner of a Petri dish, and they put oat flakes around in a pattern which matched the stops on the Tokyo subway. And once again, after a couple of days, the slime mold had extended and replicated the Tokyo subway map because it used only the shortest, distances between any two locations, and it got to all of them. So, and they've done this with other transit systems. Then they repeated the experiment with other transit systems around the world, and it's really interesting. So we've observed the observations are pretty strong. And what do we make of this? No, one of the most prevalent interpretation which scientists come up with, and which is obviously has to be at least partly true, is that they're engaged in computation. But it's an interesting kind of computation. There's a guy, Andrew Adamatsky, who's at the University of the West of England in Bristol, England, UK, and he's actually tried to he's a professor of unconventional computing. So he's interested in computers which are not based on silicon chips, but other alternate ways. So he's grown these slime molds in ways that they can, sort of simulate logic gates, and they can have a form of computation. But the interest for him is that the Physarum polycephalum is actually like a large parallel computer. The bottleneck in computers is that computers are still serial. They only do one operation at a time. You can have multi-cores and simulate, but the reason computers don't match up to brains very well is because brains are massively parallel. But even without brains, the slime mold is also massively parallel in the way it computes. So Adamatsky observes that it may not try to translate into the kinds of algorithms that computer scientists generally use to run computers. This is a quote, it may take into account factors or detect patterns unable to be discovered or revealed with conventional computer-generated models where human-biased conceptions are a priori evident. Physarum machines can actually model living phenomena in a variety of ways undetected by conventional computing methods. The heuristic dynamic of the method lies in the fact that Physarum does not simply compute. It follows unbiased physical, chemical, and biological laws which can be translated into computational language. In other words, you might be computer science are generally saying that any mental process they think they can translate into algorithms. If this is true of Physarum, the algorithms are not the same algorithms that our computers use because it's massively parallel and because it seems to do this in a different way. Another reason is because the way many natural systems work, and Physarum is a simple one, but this is true of more complicated organisms as well, is make use of affordances in the environment. So, in effect, you don't have to do something if the environment isn't. It's like bees. How do bees get perfect hexagon shapes in their hives. Basically, all the bees do is put the balls of wax next to each other, and basically for topological reasons, it comes out as perfect hexagons. They don't know how to make hexagons, but they make them because they use the affordances of the environment. So presumably Physarum is doing a lot of the same thing. But again, this is a more important general point that part of the problem with things like artificial intelligence research has been that it's often tried to think that there has to be a logical, algorithmic way to explain things, when in fact, physical, environmental factors play the role or do a lot of why it works this way rather than that way. And that's something which is not medium independent. If affordances of a physical environment create hexagons or create certain pathways for a slime mold, then replicating that digitally will not work because the digital rules will not be in the same environment which shapes what the results are independently of what the organism or the program does. So Physarum doesn't strictly compute. It does not follow rigid a priori rules. It uses affordances in the environment. In effect, it's a larger system. And this, Patricia this morning mentioned her dislike of or critique of autopoiesis as an explanation for how things happen. Autopoiesis is very much the idea that an entity, the parts of and the whole corresponds of the parts replenish and regenerate the whole, and it basically ignores the environment except as an external perturbation. But in fact, there's much more connection between internal and external, between any kind of organism or entity and the environment in which it exists. And often our computing paradigms or our autopoiesis systems model paradigms don't take this into account, which is one reason why I'd argue, just to throw out a few for that, developmental systems theory is a much better way to understand what's going on in living cells than autopoiesis, which seems to be more popular. But anyway, okay, so we have a kind of computation which is not entirely algorithmic, which is physical. It's computation, so we think of it as an abstract mental process, and yet it involves the affordances of the physical environment of both the chemicals or generated by the slime mold itself and the surroundings in which it finds itself. But there's sort of more to this. One of my favorite articles about Physarum was, it was by two British, actually, entomologists. They mostly work on insects, but they're fascinated by slime mold, so that's something we're in. Madeline Beekman and Tanya Lottie, who had an article where they say that they discovered what they call irrational behavior in slime molds. Now, I mean, the point is that this is really the reverse of what we normally think. I mean, we normally think, I guess, in everyday life that, that irrationality is the way the world works and that it's only in rare conditions that something will be rational. But it's actually kind of the reverse. Because anything operates by, physical laws of least resistance or whatever, and also the way many biologists think about evolution as, natural selection automatically takes things which are best matched with the environment and suppresses the rest. That's kind of a process which can be described in terms of classical rationality. But more advanced organisms are the only ones which are able to behave irrationally. So being able to behave irrationally is actually a sign of advanced development as opposed to simpler types of physical and biological systems. The problem with a lot of stuff, either on the left or on the right, which seems that, things will happen automatically, whether it's the right wing's invisible hand of the market or some versions of anarchist leftism which sort of believe that as long as if there's no overriding control from bottom up, everything's going to work perfectly, is that it doesn't take account of irrationality, but actually I think what I'm suggesting is irrationality is actually a high achievement of civilization, both in slime molds and in human beings. Anyway, the way this experiment went was that they gave the slime mold a series of infernal alternatives. The slime molds were offered two food sources. One of them was very nutritious, but was in bright light, which slime molds hate because they have little resistance to ultraviolet light, destroying their DNA. The other was in a dark environment, which is very safe, but the food quality was much poorer. And they run multiple trials, putting the slime mold exactly physically equidistant from these two sources and to see what it would do. So it's sort of like the medieval thing of Burden's ass, which has two bales of hay at equal distance and can't decide which one to go to and starves to death. But the slime mold didn't starve to death. It chose, and they couldn't predict the choices in any instance. They tried to say, well, maybe it's a 1/1000th of an inch closer to one than the other. That's the way it went. But they really couldn't. I mean, they really couldn't predict the choice. And this is actually something which is more widely general because organisms in general, the evidence seems to be basically all living organisms seem to have some capacity for completely random behavior. Or completely non-predictable behavior. This has been established. There was an article a few years ago where the press said fruit flies have free will because their choices were to do one thing or another were unconstrained. The scientist who did this actually wrote an article about fruit fly free will. He's not saying free will in a kind of metaphysical Cartesian sense, but in the sense that that behavior is spontaneously generated by the organism and is not constrained by initial conditions. Which it just ignores. But anyway, this seems to happen with the slime molds also. The scientists found that the slime mold, when they run multiple trials, the slime molds, they found a mathematical formulation which described the average of what the slime molds did, and it was exactly the same formula which has currently been used in so-called behavioral economics. So neoclassical economics assumes that all consumers are perfectly rational. That's obviously false. More recently, some bourgeois economists have tried to make up for this by doing actual empirical research and seeing how consumers decide which thing to buy when it's very hard to calculate which one's cheaper. And so this is defined by the laws of neoclassical economics as irrational behavior, and yet it seems to be the way people really behave, because rationality would mean you take 3 hours to calculate the exact price differential, over a long term, which would make it more beneficial to buy A versus B, and obviously nobody does that. So anyway, the slime molds, like human beings, make irrational choices when they're deciding which food to get. And so I'm almost at the end here. So okay. So we have a relatively simple compared to animals organism, which nonetheless, despite the absence of a brain, seems to think, seems to decide, seems to choose between alternatives, and also which sort of observes, and this is something which has been shown for more complex organisms also. The old model was stimulus response. You give stimuli to an organism and it responds. But in fact, the more common pattern, I think it's now emerging among biologists, is the reverse. Organisms actively test reality. Reality testing, they send out probes into the environment, see what happens in return. They have expectations because if what happens does not match what they expected, then they start doing other tests to find out what's really going on. So I mean, what this sort of means is that part of what's motivated this is I've done a lot of work in speculative realism, and speculative realism isn't really one thing, but among the philosophers who are involved with speculative realism, a number of them, most prominently Ray Brassier, have developed this kind of, to me, extremely bizarre combination of total nihilism and ultra rationalism. And the nihilistic part is probably true. Nothing means anything, everything sucks. Life is shit, and then you die, that kind of stuff. But he combines it with, however, pure rationality is totally different from the way from the mental process of animals and sentience and stuff like that. And it's actually, it's. I don't want to get into it because it'll take too long. But it's a kind of weird, kind of pragmatic, speech-centric theory of rationality. The twist which the speculative realists have is that they separate rationality from humanity. So rather than being an essential property of human beings, it's something which human beings only attain imperfectly, but which maybe other organisms or machines could attain in other cases. But I don't really believe that this kind of rationality exists. I think there's a total continuity between Robert Brandom, the analytic philosopher at the University of Pittsburgh, distinguishes very much between sapience, which he says only human beings have, and sentience, which is what he calls mere animal sentience. And this, I don't know, this really makes me angry and offends me. It seems to me that sentience isn't mere, number one, and number two, that we're a little too proud of ourselves that we think somehow because we can speak and because we can have multi-reflexive loops, that somehow we're radically different from all these other animals. So I think it's sentience all the way down and all the way up. Obviously human beings have more complex loops and self-referential meta levels and things like that, but it's still basically the same process of sentience, which as the slime mold show really happens even in the absence of brains. It's a way of testing the environment, of responding to the environment, not just responding passively to the environment, but of testing the environment, of having a back and forth between testing the environment implies you have expectations, and the expectations are either met or not. If they're not, that means that our assumptions about reality are wrong, we have to revise them by doing other kinds of reality testing. I mean, I think there's a continuity here between what slime molds do and what human scientists do and what human beings in general do. I think it's obviously the quantitative difference at some time leads to certain meta levels, which allows us to greatly amplify what we can do. But, it's like my dog is very great, is totally a genius at reading my emotional state at any moment and figuring out whether I'm going to go out or not. But he can't untangle himself from his leash. Now, the problem with cognitivism is it thinks that the ability to untangle yourself from your leash is much more important than the ability to sense and empathize with or get angry at emotional tones in other entities you're sharing your space with. And it seems to me that obviously the emotional tones are much more important and much more basic. And this becomes a larger point, which is that my ultimate meta argument, which I'm trying to there's more which I'll skip about, sort of mental unity and multiplicity, which happens in an interesting way in slime molds, but that'll probably be too long. So I'll just conclude by saying that what this means to me is that cognitivism, though it has made many interesting discoveries and stuff, is basically wanting because cognitivism is itself based on anything cognitive isn't based on what you'd have to call sentient activity, which is precognitive. And I still think the best word, this would be where I'd locate affect, not only in human beings, but in other living entities. The best word for it, I still think, is feeling, which is Whitehead's word for it. He says he's using feeling in a mere technical sense. He's sort of feeling ultimately for Whitehead is not far different from just being affecting or being affected by something else. If you're affected by something else, you're feeling it. If you're affecting something else, it's feeling you. And obviously this can go both ways, but it's not necessarily equal on both sides. And if you think of the slang use of I'm feeling this song or something like that, I think that's a probably better way of understanding Whitehead's use of feeling than more traditional talk about emotions. But anyway, what all this suggests to me is it supports the idea that feeling, and Whitehead says ultimately feeling comes down to a matter, it's more complicated, but ultimately comes down to a matter of adversion or aversion. You like certain things, you dislike certain things, you're attracted to things, you're repelled by things. You can think of it in terms of Spinozian conatus if you want, but again, I prefer Whitehead's formulation because conatus implies a drive to persevere, whereas talking about feeling leaves open the question of whether any given entity or any given actual occasion, as Whitehead calls it, wants to persevere or wants to change. I think this may be a drive to change as well as a drive to stay the same and persevere. But in any case, this is a way it seems to me that the model which I get from these scientific research about slime molds sort of supports the idea that that feeling underlies and is a necessary precondition for cognition. And cognition can only grow or take place when it's being impelled by feeling. And this seems to be what most of analytic philosophers of mind and are not paying enough attention to. The neuroscientists do a little better, but people like Damasio and other neuroscientists who have done very interesting things with emotions still sort of say emotions are these decision processes of what we're ultimately going to know cognitively about the world. And I think it's actually the reverse. And this could link up with other things as well. In particular, I link it up with what the philosopher David Rodin calls dark phenomenology, which there are certain experiences which, in a certain sense, have to be called phenomenal experience. He doesn't necessarily mean in Husserl terms phenomenology, but in the sense that where there are phenomena which we experience, but that this experience, and this is something which Whitehead already said, but which Rodin comes at as anyway, there are modes of experience which are not necessarily known, which are not necessarily cognized. And you can do this through scientific tests also. They've done scientific tests where they show people slightly different shades of red, and or of some colors, let's say red. People can distinguish between the different shades. If then 5 minutes later you show them another sample of red and said, which one of them was it? Nobody knows. They can't say. So we can attend to a subtle difference in sensorial intensity, but we can't remember it or cognize it or name it. Okay? So again, language-based theories are too much assuming that everything's reduced to what we can name, but in fact there are levels of experience which escape cognizing and which perhaps escape consciousness as well. So I'm not necessarily arguing that the slime mold is conscious and the way my dog is conscious and the way we are conscious. But I do think it definitely is having experiences and is sentient and is feeling things on the basis of which the relatively simple cognitions it makes, that's their basis. Okay, so I'm done. Thanks.